They called her cursed. The scarred waitress at Melrose Diner in Portsmouth moved silently between tables, her tall frame wrapped in long sleeves even in summer's heat. For years, Emily Carter endured cruel whispers, customers smirking at her burned hands, tossing coins onto the floor as if she were less than human. She never answered, never raised her voice, only poured coffee and carried the weight of her silence. But today, when a burly construction worker's shove sends her stumbling, the fabric of her sleeve tears loose. For the first time, her scars are bare to the world, alongside the unmistakable tattoo of a combat medic, the insignia of the 3rd Infantry Division. In that instant, a quiet man in the corner booth freezes, his weathered face paling as if he's seen a ghost. Because he knows that tattoo. He knows the woman who once pulled him from fire when all hope was lost. His recognition will shatter every cruel assumption in the diner and force a forgotten truth back into the light. What secrets has Emily hidden beneath those scars? And what will happen now that her past refuses to stay buried? The rain had just lifted from Portsmouth's narrow streets, leaving the harbor air damp and salted, the neon lights of fishing boats flickering faintly across the windows of Melrose Diner, a modest establishment that had stood for nearly 5 decades at the corner of Main and Dock Street. Inside, the hum of an old ceiling fan battled against the sticky warmth that clung to the booths and counters, the smell of bacon grease mixed with salt water drifting in from the bay. And in the middle of it all moved Emily Carter. Emily was 38 years old, tall but slightly stooped as if carrying more weight in her soul than on her back. Her dark brown hair, streaked faintly with early strands of gray, was tied into a practical knot that left strands loose around her pale, angular face. Her eyes were a deep blue, the kind that might have once glimmered with resolve, but now kept themselves lowered toward the floor or the coffee pots she carried. Her figure was lean, almost gaunt, built not from vanity, but from years of physical exertion and long shifts. What stood out most were her hands, forever hidden in the sleeves of her long uniform shirt, buttoned to the wrist even in the oppressive heat. Beneath those sleeves lay scars that twisted her flesh into patterns she could neither forget nor forgive. Customers often whispered about them, though few had actually seen them, calling her aloof, strange, or even monstrous. They had no idea that once she had been Sergeant Emily Carter, a combat medic who had carried wounded men across burning sand. But now she was only the quiet waitress at Melrose Diner who offered refills with a polite, detached smile. She endured every chuckle, every averted stare, every cruel remark, thrown under breath, storing them like stones in the pockets of her heart. Emily had learned to live with ridicule the way others lived with bad weather. It was constant, unavoidable, and safest to ignore. On this particular morning, the diner was sparsely filled. An elderly couple shared a booth near the window, the husband absorbed in a folded newspaper while his wife picked at a plate of pancakes with absent-minded precision. 2 teenagers in school jackets slouched at the counter, scrolling through their phones, smirking occasionally at Emily when she passed. In the far corner sat a man who did not smirk, did not laugh, and did not even seem to breathe with ease. His name was Daniel Hayes, a 45-year-old veteran whose presence carried the gravity of storms. Daniel's frame was broad but worn, his shoulders still strong yet bent slightly from years of carrying heavy packs and heavier memories. He wore a weather-beaten leather jacket over a faded gray T-shirt, jeans that had been patched at the knees, and sturdy boots dulled by mud and time. His hair was thick but streaked with silver, combed back in a way that revealed a sharp widow's peak, and his beard was close-trimmed but grizzled, speckled with salt. His gray-green eyes were restless, scanning the diner in intervals, and when they paused on Emily, something flickered there, a strange recognition, as if her posture and movements echoed a rhythm buried deep in his memory. Years earlier, Daniel had served in combat, and while he rarely spoke of it, those who knew him understood he carried scars invisible to the eye. Once his squad had been ambushed on a desolate road in Kandahar, and though his body had survived, his faith in humanity had been shaken by the memory of men burning, friends screaming, and the silence that followed. Since then, Daniel lived cautiously, keeping most people at arm's length, finding solace only in the loyal creature by his side, a German shepherd named Shadow. Shadow lay at Daniel's feet, his thick sable and black fur glossy even in the muted light of the diner, his ears erect and alert, and his amber eyes constantly shifting with quiet intelligence. At 6 years old, Shadow was neither young nor old, but in his prime, disciplined, attentive, trained to recognize tension before humans did. The scar across his muzzle, faint but visible, told of an encounter with danger during a training exercise years back, yet it had not dulled his nobility. Customers often hesitated when passing by Daniel's booth because of Shadow's imposing figure, but the dog never barked without reason. To Daniel, Shadow was more than a companion. He was family, confidant, and sometimes the thin line that kept despair from taking root too deeply. The bond between man and dog was the kind forged in solitude, the quiet loyalty of creatures who understood each other's silences better than words. Emily approached Daniel's booth with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long ago given up expecting kindness. Her tone was polite but flat as she asked if he wanted another cup of coffee. Daniel looked up, his weathered face tightening slightly, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Hers guarded, his searching. He nodded wordlessly, and she poured, careful as always to keep her left wrist turned inward, her sleeve tugged down. Daniel's gaze followed that motion, subtle but sharp. He had seen such guardedness before, in soldiers trying to hide wounds or medals they no longer wished to carry. Something about the angle of her posture, the precision of her movements, the way her eyes swept the diner in brief intervals, it all felt familiar. He whispered quietly to himself, words lost under the static of the ceiling fan, but Shadow's ears twitched as if he alone had heard. Across the diner the teenagers giggled, one of them whispering just loud enough for Emily to hear, "Bet she's hiding track marks." The others snickered, their laughter echoing sharper than it should in the confined space. Emily's jaw tightened, but she neither responded nor slowed her steps. She had heard variations of the same insult 100 times before. To confront it would be to invite escalation. To ignore it was survival. Daniel's eyes followed her retreating form, and his hand flexed unconsciously against the scar on his chest, a phantom reminder of the night someone's hands, steady hands, had dragged him through fire when all seemed lost. For Emily, every day at the diner was a battlefield without bullets. The clatter of plates was artillery, the whispers were shrapnel, and the laughter was a constant barrage. Her mind often drifted back to the desert nights when her scars were earned, not with shame but with purpose. Yet the world outside combat did not understand. Here, scars were not medals, they were curiosities, ugly reminders that invited judgment. She often wondered if she should have stayed in the VA hospital, anonymous among others like her, instead of trying to return to a civilian life that had no place for women like Emily Carter. And yet, here she was, carrying plates, pouring coffee, and enduring the unrelenting scrutiny of strangers. Her strength was quiet, invisible, the strength of survival rather than glory. Daniel shifted in his booth, feeling the weight of recognition pressing harder with every glance at Emily. Shadow exhaled softly, laying his chin on his paws, but keeping his eyes fixed on her as she moved behind the counter. Daniel muttered again, "It has to be her," though he barely believed his own words. The photograph folded in his jacket pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a photograph taken long ago of his unit, young and laughing, before the blast that had changed everything. Among those faces had been a medic, a woman whose determination under fire had seared itself into his memory. He had searched for her for nearly 2 decades, across VA records, veterans reunions, and endless online forums, never certain if she had lived. And now, in this unassuming harbor diner, he saw echoes of her in the quiet waitress who never looked anyone in the eye for too long. His pulse quickened, but he remained silent, waiting, uncertain, haunted by doubt, yet pulled by instinct. The morning continued with its subdued rhythm, forks scraping plates, the bell above the door chiming occasionally, the harbor wind rattling faintly against the glass. But beneath that ordinary routine, the air thickened with unseen tension, the kind only certain eyes and certain instincts could detect. Emily's silence was not simply that of a shy waitress, and Daniel's watchfulness was not simply idle curiosity. Something old, scarred, and unspoken lay between them, waiting for the moment when the past would no longer allow itself to remain hidden. Daniel Hayes remained in the corner booth of Melrose Diner, his broad shoulders filling half the space, his weathered leather jacket creaking every time he shifted. He stirred his coffee absently, eyes drifting between the other patrons and Emily Carter, the tall waitress who moved with a fluidity that unsettled him. Shadow, his German shepherd, lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head when the door jingled or when a stranger walked too close. Shadow's amber eyes seemed to reflect his master's tension, and Daniel, aware of the silent communication between them, kept one hand resting on the dog's back as if grounding himself. Daniel was a man of quiet but purposeful demeanor. The deep creases along his forehead, the slightly crooked nose, broken once in a bar fight years ago, and the scar hidden beneath his beard told a history of conflict. He was not cruel, nor was he quick to anger, but life had left him guarded. Years ago, during a tour in Afghanistan, he had watched a convoy ambush steal away men younger than him, men he had promised their mothers he would bring home. The memory of burning vehicles and screams in the night had hollowed out his humor, leaving only a watchful, skeptical man who trusted his dog more than he trusted people. And yet, today, here in this diner, something about Emily's presence stirred a recognition he had almost buried. Emily, for her part, carried herself with the weary elegance of someone perpetually on stage, performing normality for an audience, eager to jeer. She was tall, lean, her long limbs moving with efficiency, her dark hair tied into a tight knot at the back of her head, though strands escaped whenever she leaned over tables. Her pale complexion contrasted sharply with the blue of her eyes, eyes that scanned the room every few minutes like clockwork. It was a soldier's habit, checking exits, assessing threats, anticipating movements. And Daniel noticed. He recognized the way she held the coffee pot like a weapon, steady even when customers made cutting remarks. She never laughed, rarely smiled, and yet she moved with a rhythm too disciplined to belong only to a waitress. The diner itself was an ecosystem of its own, where regulars came for familiarity more than food. The elderly couple by the window left without much notice, their plates scraped clean. 2 truck drivers in heavy jackets took their place, both middle-aged, one bald with a mustache, the other heavy-set with a broad laugh that rattled the salt shakers on the table. They gave Emily a polite nod, a brief kindness that contrasted with the disdain she often endured. A young mother entered with her child, a boy of about 6 clutching a toy car, his wide eyes drawn to Shadow. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed, whispering, "Look, Mom, a soldier dog." His mother hushed him gently, embarrassed, but Daniel's lips curved almost imperceptibly. Shadow, sensing admiration rather than threat, wagged his tail once, his ears lowering in calm submission. Emily poured coffee for the truck drivers, her hands precise, her sleeves carefully pulled down despite the heat. One of the drivers tried small talk, asking about the weather over the bay, but Emily's response was clipped, polite, and she quickly excused herself. Daniel caught the shift in her posture when she walked away. the way her shoulders tightened slightly, as if every word from strangers was an intrusion. He had seen that kind of guardedness before, in soldiers who returned home unable to blend into the softness of civilian life. As the morning crowd ebbed and flowed, the bell above the door rang sharply, and the atmosphere shifted. 3 construction workers entered, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. Leading them was Kyle Barnes, a man of 35, with the frame of a weightlifter and the arrogance of someone used to filling silence with his own voice. Kyle was tall, 6'2", with cropped blonde hair and a clean-shaven jaw that accentuated his harsh features. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, quick to wander and linger where they shouldn't, and his smile was a weapon meant to belittle rather than charm. Years of shallow victories on football fields in high school, in bars where he could outdrink anyone, in job sites where he flexed rather than worked, had cemented a cruel streak in him. He was the kind of man who needed an audience to feel powerful, and this diner, quiet as it was, became his stage. Behind him trailed 2 co-workers, Darren Cole and Mark Willis, both around 30. Darren was lanky, his red hair tucked under a sweat-stained cap, freckles dusting his face, his laughter too quick and too eager whenever Kyle cracked a joke. Mark was heavier, with dark stubble covering his cheeks, a man whose tired eyes betrayed resignation, the look of someone who followed orders to keep his paycheck rather than conviction. Together, the 3 filled the diner with noise, their boots scraping, their jackets brushing against chairs as they chose a booth directly across from Daniel's. Shadow raised his head immediately, ears pricked, his gaze fixed on Kyle with an intensity that made the man pause for half a second before dismissing it with a scoff. Emily approached with her notepad, her voice even. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" Kyle leaned back, smirk spreading across his face. "Well, well, boys," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the diner. "Looks like we got ourselves a mystery waitress. Wrapped up like it's December in Alaska. What do you think she's hiding under there?" Darren chuckled obediently. Mark forced a smile. The boy with the toy car shrank against his mother's side, sensing the edge in Kyle's tone. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as his hand pressed gently on Shadow's back, signaling patience. Emily's expression did not flicker. Years of practice had made her a master of neutrality. She scribbled there, "Order black coffee, eggs, and toast," and retreated. But inside, her stomach knotted. Each word from Kyle dug into scars deeper than skin. She reminded herself to breathe, to focus on routine. Pour, serve, leave. Yet her mind betrayed her, flickering back to deserts half a world away, where taunts were gunfire and cruelty wore a different uniform. Her heart pounded, but she would not give Kyle the satisfaction of reaction. Daniel studied Kyle with the steady gaze of a man who had seen arrogance crumble under fire. He recognized the type, loud, entitled, feeding on weakness. His instinct urged him to intervene, but something in Emily's composure held him back. He wanted to see how far she would allow this cruelty before it broke the silence. Shadow shifted, letting out a low rumble from his chest, not a bark, but a warning. Kyle glanced down, sneered, and muttered, "Keep your mutt quiet." Daniel's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to Kyle, and in that moment he knew the fragile piece of the diner was hanging by threads. For Emily, the diner had always been predictable in its cruelties, but Kyle's presence promised escalation. She felt her pulse in her wrists, the scars beneath her sleeves itching as if the memory of fire had been awoken. She wondered if Daniel, the quiet man in the corner with the watchful dog, had noticed the tremor in her left hand. She suspected he had, though he said nothing. And so the morning continued, tension building under the hum of the ceiling fan, the smell of bacon and coffee unable to mask the storm brewing at Booth 3. The chapter ends here with Emily balancing her tray, Daniel observing in silence, Shadow restless at his feet, and Kyle leaning forward with a smile that promised the morning was only beginning. The morning inside Melrose Diner grew heavy the moment Kyle Barnes settled into his booth with Darren Cole and Mark Willis flanking him like lesser satellites circling a larger, darker planet. Kyle sprawled across the seat with the casual arrogance of someone convinced the world itself bent to accommodate his presence. His thick forearms rested on the table, veins bulging beneath skin tanned from outdoor work, but softened by beer and bravado. His blond hair was cropped close, almost military style, though his pale blue eyes lacked any of the discipline that cut-defined soldiers. His jaw was square and clean-shaven, but it tightened whenever someone dared ignore him, as if silence itself was an insult. Kyle thrived on noise, on dominance, on reminding others that he could draw every eye in the room. Darren, the lanky redhead with freckles, laughed a beat too early at every half-joke Kyle muttered. His baseball cap sat backward, a deliberate attempt at youthful charm that looked misplaced on his narrow, sharp-boned face. He had always been the type to cling to stronger men, afraid of standing alone, his humor borrowed from whoever seemed most powerful in the room. Mark, heavier and quieter, shifted uncomfortably, his stubble shadowing cheeks that once might have been handsome before years of exhaustion dulled them. He followed Kyle less out of loyalty and more out of inertia. Work, money, and habit kept him tethered to a man he neither admired nor liked. Yet when Kyle spoke, Mark laughed too, though his laughter carried the hollow tone of obligation. The other patrons sensed the shift immediately. The young mother at the counter tightened her grip on her son's hand, pulling him closer, her shoulders hunching like a bird protecting its chick. The truck drivers exchanged looks, one tapping his mug against the saucer in an unspoken warning that trouble had just walked in. Even the short-order cook, a burly man with tattooed forearms, glimpsed through the kitchen window, paused long enough to scowl before returning to his frying pan. Only Daniel Hayes and his German shepherd, Shadow, remained still. Daniel's gray-green eyes narrowed, his chest expanding with a long, controlled breath. Shadow lowered his head but did not close his eyes, muscles taut beneath his sable-black coat, prepared to spring if commanded. Emily Carter felt her throat dry as she approached the bully's booth. Years of experience had trained her to keep her expression neutral, but the pounding in her chest betrayed the calm mask she wore. Her long figure moved with deliberate precision, tray balanced perfectly, despite the tremor in her left hand hidden under her sleeve. Her dark brown hair, tied back, caught faint glimmers from the neon lights outside the diner window. She hated the way Kyle's eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with hunger, the kind of predatory gaze that stripped dignity. Her scars itched beneath the fabric of her uniform, phantom heat crawling across her wrists. She forced herself to breathe. Kyle leaned back, grinning wide enough to show the uneven line of his teeth. "Well, boys, here comes the star of the show," he said, voice carrying through the diner with theatrical cruelty. "Still hiding those arms, sweetheart? What's under there? Some prison ink? Or maybe burns from a meth lab accident?" Darren barked out laughter immediately, slapping the table so hard the silverware rattled. Mark chuckled too, though his eyes darted briefly toward Emily, then away, betraying a flicker of unease. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She had been called worse, endured more vicious accusations, yet every time the sting returned fresh, as if the years had done nothing to dull it. She set the coffees before them with steady hands, her voice even. 3 coffees, 2 eggs and toast, 1 ham and cheese. She did not look at them, did not respond to the bait. Kyle's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he leaned forward again. "Come on, don't be shy," he pressed, his pale eyes gleaming. "Let the crowd see what you're hiding. We all got imperfections, don't we? Or maybe yours are so bad they scare kids." "Hey, Darren, you think that's why she's covering up?" Darren laughed again, nervously this time, while Mark shifted in his seat, staring at the sugar packets as if they held an answer. The mother with the child whispered, "Ignore them," under her breath, pulling her boy toward the door. The boy protested softly, eyes lingering on Shadow, who raised his head now, ears erect, amber gaze locked on Kyle with a calm but deadly focus. Daniel's hand slid along the table, his fingers curling slowly into a fist, before he forced them open again. He had learned restraint through years of discipline, but every instinct screamed for him to stand. Instead, he waited, measuring. Emily turned, retreating to the counter, her pulse hammering in her temples. She hated how her body betrayed her, how her breath came shallow, how her scars seemed to burn beneath their scrutiny. Memories surged unwanted, flames licking through the night, the heat of explosions, the sound of men calling her name through smoke. She pressed her nails into her palm, through the fabric of her sleeve, until pain grounded her. She could not afford to break here. Not now. Kyle leaned back, laughing loudly enough to fill the silence left behind. "That's what I thought," he declared to no one in particular, to everyone in the diner who had lowered their eyes to avoid the scene. He thrived on their silence, mistaking it for approval. His voice boomed again. "What kind of freak hides herself in summer? Bet if she rolled those sleeves up, we'd all lose our appetites." Daniel rose slowly from his booth then, not fully but enough that his shadow stretched across the floor toward Kyle's table. Shadow mirrored him, standing, muscles tensed, head slightly lowered in warning. Daniel's gaze never left Kyle, and for the first time, Kyle faltered, a flicker of hesitation darting across his face. But pride refused him retreat, and so he laughed louder, a brittle sound, to cover the crack in his armor. Emily glanced at Daniel, their eyes meeting for a heartbeat. In his steady gaze she saw recognition, not of her scars, but of her endurance, her silence, her strength. He had seen this battle before, knew its shape, and for the first time in years, Emily did not feel entirely alone in the diner. The chapter closes with Kyle's voice still echoing in the corners of Melrose Diner, the patrons tense, Emily gripping the counter until her knuckles whitened, Daniel standing in quiet defiance, and Shadow's low growl promising the storm was only beginning. The tension in Melrose Diner reached a breaking point when Kyle Barnes leaned forward, his smirk sharpening into something crueler. The clatter of forks and the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of his boots scraping against the linoleum as he shifted. Emily Carter had just set a plate of eggs and toast onto the table when Kyle, either out of malice or the intoxication of his own bravado, thrust his arm out suddenly, shoving her shoulder with more force than necessary. The motion, though brief, was violent enough to spin Emily half sideways. The tray in her other hand tilted precariously, cups rattling before she caught them with the reflex of someone trained to remain calm even under duress. But what she could not stop was the fabric of her left sleeve snagging against the corner of the booth. The button popped loose with a tiny snap that echoed far louder in her mind than it should have. Her sleeve fell back to her elbow, bearing flesh she had concealed for years. The diner fell silent in an instant. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups hung frozen halfway to lips. The young boy at the counter gasped audibly, and his mother clutched him closer, not from fear but from shock. Emily's arm was exposed, scarred flesh twisted into ridges and valleys of burn marks, pale and pink against her skin. But more striking than the scars was the ink that cut through them, dark and indelible, a tattoo of the medical insignia of the 3rd Infantry Division, flanked by the unit number beneath it. The image was unmistakable to anyone who had served, a badge of brotherhood and loss that could not be faked, could not be misunderstood. Daniel Hayes shot to his feet before he realized he had moved, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet. Shadow rose with him, the German shepherd's fur bristling, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest as his eyes locked on Kyle. But Daniel's gaze was not on the bully. It was fixed entirely on Emily. His gray-green eyes widened, his face paling as if the years collapsed inward, dragging him back to that night of fire and sand. His lips parted, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen that tattoo before, in the chaos of a burning convoy, when hands marked by those same scars had pulled him out of a wreckage that should have been his grave. Emily froze under the weight of every gaze in the room. Heat flushed her neck, rising into her cheeks, not from shame, but from panic. Her heart thundered against her ribs, each beat echoing like a drum. For 3 years she had kept her past hidden beneath long sleeves, burying herself in routine, anonymity, and silence. Now, in the space of a single careless shove, it was all undone. She yanked at the sleeve, trying to cover herself, but her fingers fumbled. She could feel the stairs like knives, cutting into her skin deeper than the scars ever had. Shame battled with fury, with grief, with the instinct to flee. Her feet shifted toward the exit almost without thought, her mind screaming for escape. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice raw, carrying across the diner with a certainty that froze her mid-step. He had not spoken her name aloud before, had not dared to believe until now. But there it was, carved from memory, heavy with recognition. Every patron turned toward him, confusion rippling through their expressions. The bullies, too, fell momentarily silent, their smirks fading as they realized the air had changed. Kyle blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden reverence in Daniel's tone. "What, you know her?" he said, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying a hesitation he hadn't felt moments earlier. Darren shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Mark stared at Emily's arm with something like dawning understanding. Emily's eyes darted to Daniel, wide and desperate, pleading silently for him not to continue. Her chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, her breathing uneven, her body trembling with the weight of 18 years of memories clawing their way back to the surface. She wanted to deny it, to pull her sleeve back down, to laugh it off as a meaningless tattoo. But Daniel's gaze anchored her. He wasn't seeing a waitress. He wasn't seeing a freak. He was seeing her, the woman who had crawled into fire when others fled. Daniel took a step forward, his boots echoing against the linoleum, Shadow pacing perfectly beside him, eyes still on Kyle, but ears twitching at the trembling in Emily's breath. "It's you," Daniel whispered, though the whole diner could hear. "It has to be." That night, Kandahar, July 06, you pulled me out when the Humvee caught fire. You dragged Thompson too, even when the ammo started cooking off. God almighty, it's you. Emily staggered back, her hand gripping the counter to steady herself. Tears threatened, blurring her vision, but she blinked them away, shaking her head as if to deny him. "No," she said hoarsely, her voice cracking. "You weren't supposed to be alive. They told me. You didn't make it. They said you died in Germany." Her words spilled in gasps, each one punctured by guilt that had festered for nearly 2 decades. The cook stepped out from the kitchen then, a burly man in his 50s with tattooed arms and a grease-stained apron. His brow furrowed as he looked from Daniel to Emily, then to the exposed ink on her scarred arm. He recognized it immediately. His brother had served in the same division years earlier. "That's no fake," he muttered, almost reverently. The room seemed to exhale at once, as if confirmation had been granted. Kyle bristled, trying to reclaim control. His pale eyes darted between Emily and Daniel, searching for a crack he could exploit. "So what?" he sneered, though the edge of confidence was gone. "A tattoo don't mean nothing. People fake them all the time." His words rang hollow in the heavy silence, but the silence was No's. Longer his to command. It belonged to Emily's scars, to Daniel's recognition, to the truth that had clawed its way into the light. And in that silence, every customer in the diner saw Emily not as a monster, not as a curiosity, but as someone who carried fire on her skin because she had walked through it to save others. Emily's hand trembled as she tugged at her sleeve again, but she stopped halfway, her body rigid with the realization that it was pointless to hide anymore. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a breath she had held for years, and when she opened them, Daniel was still there, steady, unshaken, calling her back from the edge of flight. The chapter ends with Emily caught between the urge to run and the pull of recognition. The diner suspended in silence, Daniel's voice echoing like a lifeline, and Kyle's smirk fading into uncertainty as the weight of truth shifted the balance of the room. The silence in Melrose Diner stretched like taut wire, every patron holding their breath as Daniel Hayes stood near Emily Carter, his presence carrying a gravity that none could dismiss. His gray-green eyes burned with recognition. His broad frame straightened as though the years had melted away, and he was once again a soldier in the thick of fire. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy, filled with the weight of memory. "You all see those scars, that tattoo," he began, his tone low yet carrying through the entire diner. "Let me tell you what they mean." He shifted his weight, his leather jacket creaking, shadow pressed close at his leg, ears pricked, as if sensing that something sacred was being unearthed. Daniel's roughened hands, scarred knuckles, veins raised like cords, gripped the back of a chair. July 2006, Kandahar Province. Our convoy was hit on a dirt road carved through dust and silence. The first IED went off under the lead Humvee, fire swallowing metal in seconds. Shrapnel tore the air. Men screamed. Chaos doesn't even cover it. His voice cracked slightly, his jaw clenched. He swallowed hard before continuing. Emily's breath hitched, her blue eyes darting toward the floor. Her fingers curled tight against her sleeve, but she did not stop him. Daniel continued, his voice gaining rhythm. "I was in the third vehicle." The blast flipped us on our side. Ammo started to cook off. I was pinned, chest crushed against the frame, smoke choking my lungs. I remember trying to rip the door, but it wouldn't budge. My vision blurred. I thought that was it. Then she appeared. His hand lifted, pointing toward Emily. All eyes turned. "She wasn't supposed to be there," Daniel went on, his voice rough, his breath audible. "She was the unit medic, Sergeant Emily Carter. She had orders to stay back with the wounded from another detail. But she didn't. She ran toward the fire. She climbed into hell itself." His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "She dragged me out through a window no bigger than this plate." He slapped his palm against the nearest table. The truck drivers flinched at the sound. The mother with her boy stared at Emily, her lips parted in disbelief. Darren Cole shifted nervously, his freckles paling, while Mark Willis dropped his gaze, guilt flickering in his eyes. Kyle Barnes leaned back, his smirk gone, his pale blue eyes darting around as if seeking escape. Daniel pressed on, voice trembling but resolute. 16 men lived that night because of her. 16. You know what she did? When the second blast came, when everyone else dove for cover, she threw herself across me, shielded me with her body. She went back into the flames, again and again, dragging men out while rounds exploded around her. She carried Thompson out with a head wound, Rodriguez with a collapsed lung, even pulled Corporal Hughes when the roof caved in. She ignored every order, every sane instinct, because leaving us wasn't an option for her. His voice rose, echoing like a prayer. Emily's shoulders shook. Her tall frame seemed smaller now, shrinking under the memories that Daniel's words forced to the surface. Tears rimmed her eyes, her pale skin blotched with color, but she refused to let them fall. The scars on her arms pulsed as though reliving their origin. The cook, Bob Hutchinson, stepped fully into the diner, his grease-stained apron brushing against his thick forearms, tattoos shifting as his muscles flexed. His weathered face was carved with lines of a man who had once served himself in another war long past. 16, he repeated softly, almost reverently. That's more than most medics save in their whole tour. His eyes fixed on Emily with new respect. Daniel's chest heaved as though he had fought through the smoke again just by telling the story. He pointed again at Emily, his hand steady. She never told anyone. She hides those scars because this world doesn't understand them. But I owe her my life, and so do 16 families who don't even know her name. The diner seemed to shrink around them, every patron leaning closer, captivated by the unfolding truth. The truck drivers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The young boy whispered to his mother, "She's a hero." His small voice cut through the air, pure and honest. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears as she nodded. Emily could no longer hold back. Her voice trembled as she spoke for the first time since the reveal. "I didn't save them all," she whispered. Her words cracked like brittle glass. "Rodriguez didn't make it. Neither did Sergeant Cole. I tried. I swear I tried. I still hear their voices at night." Her hands clenched, knuckles white, as though she were still dragging bodies from fire. "You call me a hero, but all I see are the ones I couldn't bring back." Daniel shook his head fiercely, his eyes flashing. "That's survivor's guilt talking. Don't you dare diminish what you did. None of us would have made it out if not for you." He reached out, his scarred hand hovering near her arm, but not touching, as though offering connection without forcing it. The atmosphere shifted. Kyle Barnes, who had fed off the diner's silence earlier, now found himself exposed. His pale blue eyes darted, his lips curled into a sneer, but the weight of the room pressed him down. He muttered, "People fake stories all the time," but his voice lacked conviction. No one laughed. Darren's freckles darkened with shame as he lowered his head, Mark's broad shoulders sagged, and even the boy's wide eyes glared at Kyle with unfiltered disgust. Shadow, sensing the tension fading, lowered himself back onto the floor, but kept his amber gaze fixed on Kyle, ready should hostility return. Daniel straightened, his gray-green eyes sweeping the room. "You've all seen what she carries. Those scars aren't shame. They're proof she chose others before herself, again and again. And if anyone here still doubts, let them look me in the eye and tell me I'm lying." His stare locked on Kyle, daring him. Kyle flinched, looked away, and silence sealed his defeat. The chapter closes with Emily trembling yet standing taller, the weight of truth heavy but shared at last. Daniel unflinching beside her, Shadow at his feet, and the diner filled not with ridicule but with reverence for the forgotten medic whose scars told a story of valor. Kyle Barnes's pale blue eyes darted around the diner as if seeking an exit from the weight pressing down on him. His smirk had faltered, yet pride demanded he fight back. He pushed himself upright, his tall frame towering over the booth, muscles flexing beneath his gray construction shirt. His clean-shaven jaw clenched tight, and his nostrils flared like a cornered animal. "This is bullshit," he snapped, his voice louder than it needed to be, forcing false bravado into the silence. "People fake tattoos all the time. She's just some waitress milking sympathy. You think scars make her a hero? No, it's stolen valor, and it's sickening." His words cut across the diner like jagged glass. Emily Carter's body stiffened, her tall figure rigid as though bracing for another blow. Her dark hair clung in loose strands around her pale face, her blue eyes wide, struggling to hide the storm of shame and fury. Her hand twitched near her sleeve, the old instinct to cover herself reawakening. The scars burned under every gaze, not from pain, but from the humiliation of being accused of lies when truth itself was etched into her skin. Daniel Hayes moved without hesitation. His broad shoulders squared, his leather jacket stretching over his frame as he stepped forward. His weathered face was stern, jaw shadowed by gray stubble, gray-green eyes hard as steel. His voice rumbled low but carried across every corner of the diner. "Watch your mouth." Shadow, the German shepherd at his side, mirrored his master's stance, rising to full height, his thick coat bristling. The dog's amber eyes locked on Kyle, a low growl vibrating through his chest. The sound was primal, enough to make Darren Cole shrink back into the booth, freckles paling against his narrow face, while Mark Willis's broad shoulders sagged, shame and fear written across his stubbled features. The tension thickened, but then another voice cut through, older, worn but unshakable. From the far end of the diner, a man in his 60s rose slowly from his seat. His name was Frank Doyle, a retired Marine who had been sitting quietly with his wife. Frank's frame was lean but wiry, his posture still upright despite the years. His weathered skin was marked with sunspots, his gray hair trimmed short, and his jawline was sharp, though softened by age. He wore a plain flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, boots scuffed from years of work. His eyes, steel blue and steady, spoke of deserts and jungles long past. He carried himself with the gravity of someone who had seen men fall and refused to let their memories be tarnished. "I served in Vietnam," Frank said, his voice gravelly but strong, cutting through Kyle's accusations. "I've seen fakes. I know the smell of lies, and I know the look of a soldier who's carried others out of hell. That woman right there, she's no fraud. She's the real thing." He pointed at Emily with a hand roughened by years, his wedding band glinting, under the diner's harsh light. "You sit there, calling her a liar, while you've never heard the sound of incoming rounds or watched brothers bleed out in your arms, so shut your damn mouth." The diner erupted. Not in noise, but in solidarity. The truck drivers nodded, one pounding his fist gently against the table in agreement. The young mother, still clutching her son, whispered, "Thank you," toward Emily. The boy's eyes glowed with admiration as he whispered again, "She's a hero," louder this time, unafraid. Even the cook, Bob Hutchinson, leaned against the service window with his tattooed arms crossed, his voice gruff but clear. "The man's right. I'd trust her over you any day," Kyle faltered. His pale blue eyes, once predatory, now darted nervously, meeting only condemnation. His height and muscles no longer made him powerful here. He tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. "You're all buying into some sob story." But his words broke off when Shadow's growl deepened, the German shepherd taking a step forward, protective, the leash taut under Daniel's hand. The animal's presence spoke louder than any words, unyielding, loyal, ready. Daniel's voice thundered now, years of buried rage boiling up. "You want to talk about stolen valor? Look in the mirror. You bully women to feel strong. You humiliate strangers to make up for the emptiness in your own life. But you don't get to spit on her name. Not here, not in front of me, and not in front of anyone who's ever worn a uniform." His scarred hand slammed down on the table for emphasis, the sound sharp and final. The weight of the room crushed Kyle. Darren Cole shifted uneasily, glancing between the patrons and Kyle before muttering, "Maybe we should go." Mark Willis stared at the floor, shame coating every line of his broad frame. Even they had begun to peel away from Kyle's shadow, leaving him exposed. Emily stood trembling, tears glimmering in her eyes, but for the first time she didn't bow her head. Her tall figure straightened, her shoulders set, her blue eyes fierce, despite the fear that knotted her stomach. She looked at Kyle not with shame, but with something he couldn't fight: dignity. The chapter closes with Kyle standing isolated, his accusations drowned beneath a tidal wave of truth. Emily is no longer the quiet, ridiculed waitress, but the woman every soul in the diner now recognized as a forgotten hero. Daniel and Shadow stand protectively beside her, Frank Doyle's voice still echoing like judgment, and the customers united in their support as Kyle's arrogance collapses into silence. Kyle Barnes stood frozen for a moment, his tall, muscular frame suddenly looking smaller than it ever had. His pale blue eyes, once bright with arrogant fire, now darted nervously from face to face. Darren Cole's freckles had drained of color, the lanky redhead sliding out of the booth as though trying to vanish. Mark Willis, heavy-set with tired eyes, rubbed his stubbled jaw, shame written across his expression. Neither man moved to stand with Kyle. The balance of the diner had shifted completely, and Kyle knew it. His jaw worked as if chewing on words he couldn't form before he muttered something indistinct and pushed past the booth. His broad shoulders hunched, his boots loud against the floor. But his presence no longer filled the room with menace, only with the stench of humiliation. Darren and Mark followed quickly. Darren's laugh gone. Mark's silence. Heavier than ever. The bell above the door chimed as they left, the sound of final punctuation to their collapse. Emily Carter stood at the counter, her tall, lean figure trembling. Her dark brown hair clung damp to her temples, and her pale skin flushed crimson under the fluorescent lights. Her scarred arm, still half exposed, felt naked not because of shame, but because of the vulnerability of being truly seen. Her blue eyes shimmered, tears rising unchecked now. For years she had endured whispers, sneers, and cruel speculation in silence. For years she had carried survivor's guilt like a chain dragging her down. And now, in a single hour, the weight broke loose. She dropped the coffee pot she held onto the counter with a soft clatter and covered her face with her hands. Her sobs began quietly, but they came from deep within, the kind that rattled the soul. Daniel Hayes was beside her almost instantly. His broad frame, wrapped in a weathered leather jacket, curved protectively around her. His scarred hand rested gently on her shoulder. His gray-green eyes filled with a raw gratitude he could barely contain. His voice, low and rough, cut through her tears. "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved all of us. I've spent 18 years breathing because of you, and I'll never let you forget that again." He pulled her into his chest, his embrace firm but not crushing, the kind of hug that acknowledged her strength even as it lent her his. His jaw tightened, tears burning his own eyes, though he refused to let them fall. At his feet, Shadow sat close, the 6-year-old German shepherd pressing his sturdy frame against Emily's legs. His sable-black coat gleamed under the lights, his amber eyes calm and steady. The dog tilted his head slightly, as if understanding the moment, and nudged his muzzle softly against Emily's arm. In his silent, loyal way, Shadow offered comfort, unwavering, unconditional. The diner, once filled with ridicule, now filled with applause. It began with the truck driver at the counter, a bald man with a thick mustache who slapped his calloused palm against the table. His friend followed, laughter gone, replaced by a nod of deep respect. The young mother clutched her son close, tears rolling down her cheeks, while the boy beamed, his toy car forgotten as he clapped with small hands. Bob Hutchinson, the burly cook with tattooed arms, stepped out from the kitchen, his grease-stained apron swinging as he approached. His voice, usually rough with impatience, softened as he said, "Emily, 3 years you've worked here, and I never knew. That's on me. But from this day forward, this place knows who you are." Frank Doyle, the wiry Vietnam veteran with steel blue eyes, stood tall beside his wife, his flannel shirt wrinkled but his posture unbowed. His voice, gravelly and filled with conviction, rang out, Heroes don't always wear uniforms anymore. Sometimes they pour our coffee. Sometimes they carry scars so the rest of us can go home. Remember that his words sealed the moment, embedding it into the diner's walls. Within a week, Melrose Diner changed. On one wall, Bob hung a framed photograph of Emily, taken by a local journalist who had rushed in after the story spread through Portsmouth like fire on the wind. In the photo, Emily stood awkwardly, tall and slender, her dark hair loose, her scarred arm visible but no longer hidden. Beneath the frame, a brass plate bore two words, "Hometown Hero." Around it, other photos of veterans were added, Frank's younger self in fatigues, Bob's late brother in uniform, Daniel's old unit. The diner became a shrine not of war, but of resilience. Emily adjusted slowly to the attention. Strangers approached her not with cruelty, but with gratitude. Children pointed at her tattoo and asked questions. Older veterans clasped her hand and murmured thanks. For years she had felt invisible, her scars a burden. Now they were symbols of sacrifice. She still carried guilt, but no longer alone. Each time she felt the old weight return, she would glance at the photo on the wall, at Daniel sitting quietly in his corner booth, or at Shadow wagging his tail patiently. And she would breathe easier. One crisp morning, the city of Portsmouth honored her officially. The mayor, a stout man in his 50s, with thinning hair and a booming voice, stood on the steps of City Hall and read her name aloud. Veterans lined the street, saluting as she passed. The applause embarrassed her, her cheeks burning crimson, but Daniel walked beside her, tall and steady, while Shadow trotted proudly at her side. For the first time, Emily felt the scars on her arms not as marks of shame, but as proof she had lived, proof she had mattered. Back at the diner, she lingered after the crowd left, her blue eyes tracing the words, "Hometown Hero." Daniel joined her, his leather jacket smelling faintly of tobacco and rain. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. Emily turned, tears glistening, and nodded. The chapter closes with Emily, Daniel, and Shadow stepping out of Bois. Melrose Diner together into the salted Portsmouth air. They were no longer isolated souls, a forgotten medic, a haunted soldier, and a loyal dog, but a family forged by war, bound by trust, and strengthened by the simple grace of being understood at last. In the end, Emily's scars were not marks of shame, but silent testimonies of love, sacrifice, and the miracles that God can weave through the darkest nights. Sometimes His grace hides in ordinary places, in a diner, in a loyal dog's gaze, or in the embrace of a friend who refuses to let go. Just as Emily found light after years of shadows, may we remember that in our daily struggles, God's hand is never far, and His mercy can turn pain into purpose. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear your reflections. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of faith, resilience, and the quiet miracles around us. May God bless you and keep you safe, always.